begin the paper by acknowledging the original custodians of land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank Heidi for a really rigorous and invigorating talk. I'm not sure how much mine will be able to speak to some of the librarians in the room, but we will see. Today I'll be presenting some initial findings of research that myself and colleagues Francesco Bailo, who's just over there in the check shirt, and Marian-Andre Rizoiu are working on, which is looking at how misinformation and hate speech diffusions spread across social media platforms. At the moment, we're focusing on the spread of misinformation on social media in the context of the Australian bushfires, which some of you would probably be familiar with. As it's a mixed method study using qualitative and computational methods, the final recommendations will probably at least partially focus on technological solutions to misinformation rather than digital literacy. But for this paper, I want to think about the pros and cons of digital literacy in addressing such a big social problem as misinformation. To explore this, I'll present some views from the experts on digital literacy, and then present some quick snapshots from our initial research findings to consider what kinds of digital literacy education might work and what perhaps doesn't work in addressing such a complex phenomenon as the problem of misinformation. But first of all, I want to give a brief history of the concept, even though Heidi's done that quite well. We've often heard about digital literacy being posed as a solution for a range of opportunities and risks that have arisen with the ubiquitous use of digital media, and particularly social media. Some of these Heidi has mentioned. Digital literacy is seen to solve our democratic deficit by mobilising civil society and enabling citizens to have an equal voice in and participate in society. It's also been seen to enable citizens to collectively address some of the big social problems of our time. And again, Heidi has kind of looked at the scale of some of those. For example, it's been implicated in the fight against terror, the fight against racism and hate speech, and more recently in the fight against misinformation. But despite these big ambitions for the concept, it began its life more as a stimulus to update primary and high school curriculum to acknowledge a shift in the way people learn and communicate in a digital society, and to build technical skills in students to capitalise on these opportunities. So it was more about the opportunities more than the negative aspects originally. What was the concern then was building technical skills in students, those technical skills they would need to navigate digital environments and become effective citizens in an information society. When these big and complex social problems got added as phenomena for digital literacy to fix, such as democratic deficit, such as fighting terrorism, such as fighting the problem of misinformation, it's become clear that technical skills alone aren't enough to address some of these particular challenges. Okay, so for example, having the tools and skills to participate online while addressing some barriers of inclusion is not enough to overcome structural problems of racism, of gender inequality, classism and poverty. And I'm just going to, as a provocation, look at the history of trolling to kind of explain why technical skills are certainly not enough to address some of these problems. So trolling is one example of a highly digitally literate social group who are active on social media. We can see that being in possession of technical skills and knowledge of how information circulates online, for example, how contents go viral, what leads people to click on online content in the case of clickbait, having awareness of these and having the technical skills to exploit them is not enough to solve some of the big social problems that have been addressed, problems of racism, of hate speech, of misinformation. Rather, the objective of the troll is to exploit some of these technical affordances to spread hate and misinformation. And I want to refer you here to Whitney Phillips, who's done a comprehensive amount of research on trolling subcultures on 4chan. Let me click through here. She arrived at the conclusion that trolls use racist language and images as bait to increase engagement with their posts and thereby enter and influence mainstream media discourse in order to mess with it. Their project is to create information disorder, to infect and destabilise elitist liberal mainstream political discourse and sense-making institutions. Whether or not they are white supremacists, if they use racist epithets and discourses, is not always the highest consideration, because they don't share the information necessarily because they believe it to be true. As Phillips here says, trolls need their language to contain a kernel of hate. From their perspective, it's purely a practical point. If the epithets in question weren't politically contentious, they wouldn't be useful. The content they're wanting to spread would not spread. As this example shows, digital literacy, where it refers to mere technical skills and knowledge, doesn't address questions of why people share misinformation, their motives. It also doesn't sufficiently address structural problems associated with social media platforms themselves, which allow people to create and circulate user-generated contents without editorial review or oversight, and where the design of platforms is to encourage and reward engagement. Whether the information is quality or important or credible is of no concern to the business of social media. And indeed, we know that what's popular and sensational trends, that includes hoaxes, conspiracy theories, propaganda, disinformation, and as trolls know all too well, racism. In response to some of these challenges, a new consensus is beginning to form, as Heidi mentioned, that digital media literacy must be about much more than having skills and tools to navigate digital environments, but that citizens must be able to critically and ethically navigate these environments. However, this approach runs into another problem. It's long been acknowledged that who gets to determine what is good or accurate or quality information and what is ethical digital media practice is not always easily settled. If we consider the case of the troll, for example, their mission to destabilise elitist knowledge is considered an ethos to them. It's a political goal. And nor is this a fringe ethos. It closely aligns with the conservative right's populist agenda to spread anti-elitist, anti-PC discourses to its base to garner support. A base who, as media scholar Dana Boyd said recently in a TED talk, loathe hearing the never-ending parade of rich and powerful people suggesting that they're stupid, backwards, and otherwise lesser. Embracing being anti-PC has become a source of pride, a tactic of resistance. This makes the problem of elite institutions educating users as to what information is good and what is bad limited in its effectiveness, and I will return to this. But just wanting to let you feast on some of Dana Boyd's discussion at a recent TED Talk here. In response to the critique of digital literacy, solutions which focus on the technical reasons why disinformation spreads, beyond focusing on the individual user, is often seen as a more effective alternative. The latter scholarship focuses on how false, misleading, or politically biased information is weaponised and spread through design and programming of platforms and platform functionalities and tools, which promote user engagement over quality of information. Apart from the case of the troll, much of the focus of contemporary scholarship on misinformation and disinformation is on cases where deliberate misinformation campaigns have been waged by groups or nations trying to influence the public conversation around key policy issues. A prime example of this is the Russian troll farms who set up armies of bots and fake accounts in the 2016 US presidential election to spread false and misleading information about Hillary Clinton. Campaigns such as this show how misinformation can be put on equal standing with good information on social media platforms through sheer volume or scale, or because of a sensational headline or image that generates clicks. Scholars focusing on these effects rightly feel that digital media literacy is not going to fix the structural problem, and instead platforms need to be held accountable. Because their business model has led to popular information taking precedence over quality information, governments should compel them to improve their systems of detecting and moderating information that is false or misleading and to remove it. However, Technological solutions, while perhaps effective in addressing some of these more high-end, deliberate misinformation campaigns, don't always address the reasons and the root causes why everyday users share misinformation, which often go beyond trolls and state or political party-sponsored campaigns. And Heidi signalled to some of these, so I won't go through them again. In some cases, it might be that you share misinformation because you're in a particular community and a particular view is prevalent, and even if you're not sure if the information is true, you might be sharing it for some of those reasons of social conformity, etc. The technological solution also tends to view the average user as a passive receiver and thoughtless or duped sharer of information rather than actively producing media contents or actively reading and sharing information. Not because they know it's good information and they know it's true, but because it aligns with their worldview and beliefs. Advocates of digital literacy education often make this mistake too. They see the person sharing the information as dupes or as having been fooled. This is lamented by Dana Boyd again, and I'll point you again to this quote down the bottom there. Right now, the conversation around fact-checking has already devolved to suggest that there is only one truth. If we're not careful, media literacy and critical thinking will simply be deployed as an assertion of authority over epistemology, so that there is one liberal truth that is being taught in our institutions, that there is no deviation from that. And of course, that is triggering for a lot of people who would have different worldviews and would hold different thoughts about that. I want to turn my attention now to some key findings from our research on the Australian bushfires and the misinformation industries that have cropped up to feed on such events, to challenge some of the logic underpinning claims that more digital literacy is a solution to the problem of misinformation. In particular, I want to suggest that claims that users need to be educated on how to more effectively fact-check sources misrecognises one of the key weapons of the misinformation industry, which is their use of pseudoscience or alternative facts, which again can confuse and muddy the information that is out there. This is research that we're just completing a very initial stage of it, so it's a little bit quick and dirty, this analysis, but nonetheless I think it speaks to some of the claims that I'm making here. So based on an analysis of Twitter data between the 1st of January 2020 and 31st of January, and using an analysis tool that predicted whether the tweets scraped were left or right-leaning, we were able to obtain data about what content was being shared under these following hashtags. And again, some of them perhaps you've contributed to: climate emergency. I want you to just take that number beside there as the sort of number of tweets in this particular time period under those hashtags. So climate emergency, the most popular, Scotty from marketing, we know, which probably had a lot of left-leaning people contributing to that hashtag, all the way down to climate hoax, which was identified as having much more right-leaning people sharing information on there, and in particular sharing misinformation. After this initial scraping, we drilled down further to see what links or what content from what sources was being shared by left users of Twitter as opposed to right or more conservative users of Twitter. Okay. So the top listed, the analysis the analysis found that predominantly contents from social media sites were shared on the left and the right, so Twitter and YouTube up the top there, for example, on the right. But amongst right-leaning users, this was closely followed by contents from mainstream news organisations. And in fact, the most popular news organisation where content was shared from was The Guardian, which actually shows that a lot of this conversation was left-leaning. And when you can see the numbers of tweets from those particular sources of content, you can see that a lot of them were from legitimate news organisations, and a lot of them were on the left. But amongst right-leaning users, some alternative news organisations and sources were also in the mix. Okay, so there's technocracy.news there, Zero Hedge, principiascientific.org, Red State. You might want to look some of these up. Breitbart also was in the top 20. The top listed source on the, so just to let you know, this is what I want to focus on basically for the remainder of the paper. The top listed source, which is technocracy.news on the right, was retweeted only 17 times, but it's significant in terms of looking at how misinformation is spread. This is a website that publishes news-style articles on a range of issues, but all are framed by an anti-science ideology. They identify climate change as a global conspiracy to insert what they call technocratic governments, where society becomes controlled by an elite of technical experts. The editor-in-chief of technocracy.news is a self-described economist by education, a financial analyst and writer by profession, and an American constitutionalist by choice. His profile on the website claims he maintains a biblical worldview and has deep historical insights into modern attacks on sovereignty, property rights, and personal freedom. Such attacks, he says, are epitomised by the implementation of UN policies such as Agenda 21, and this refers to the non-binding action plan of the UN with regard to sustainable development, smart growth, and in education, the widespread adoption of Common Core State Standards, which is basically an agenda for making sure that students in the US are ready for university and for life. So some core competencies that they should be learning. He's critical of them. Okay, so we can see that there are there's a suggestion here, and in terms of the articles that are often shared on this particular website, they're critical not just of climate change and the science behind it, but they're critical of a lot of, institutions that share scientific knowledge. They're critical of a lot of elitist or supposedly elitist discourses. So they very much resist, if you like, some of the established information. Zero Hedge, who are fourth on the list on the right, was permanently suspended from Twitter last Friday for violating Twitter's platform manipulation policy because they published an article that identified a Chinese scientist at Wuhan's Institute of Virology in a conspiracy to cover up how the coronavirus started. And if you look at the website, and I invite you to do that, one of the top news articles they have listed there is saying it was actually developed as a weapon of mass destruction. But interestingly, some of the other articles shared on the website are less laughable. They do point out, if you like, or use sources, data sources from credible sources, and they will highlight small bits of information and critique how they've been presented in the mainstream discourse, and actually refer to ways data has been presented that perhaps misrepresents or presents one truth in a way that misrepresents the data. So they engage in using a lot of statistics, a lot of graphs, a lot of information that people can use to fact check if they're perhaps interested in being sceptical about climate change and not adhering to the consensus, the scientific consensus. They're invited by some of these organisations to look at some alternative facts. And there is a kind of a tendency for pseudoscientific information to be shared on some of these platforms. What is common to much of the alternative news sources shared by right-leaning users on Twitter was their anti-elitist agenda, but also, ironically, their desire, as I mentioned, to use statistics and evidence, as I mentioned, including from some credible data sources to support their claims. So where does this leave digital literacy education? I do want us to think deeply about what good digital literacy education might look like in this current environment, where hate is weaponised, but also where misinformation poses as good science and good information. Because if the average media consumer is asked to fact check, you'd be amazed at the facts that they might find on social media, presented alongside statistics and evidence that look compelling. If the layperson is asked to choose between these facts, how do they arrive at what is right or good or better information? Dana Boyd says, not incorrectly in her TED talk, that at some point it comes down to faith, worldview, the culture we're immersed in, rather than literacy. But I'm not quite as sceptical as Dana Boyd is, and I do agree with Heidi that our job as educators is to discern what is good from bad or misleading information and to boost our students' critical thinking skills to discern the difference. Whether this is just about digital literacy, though, I'm not sure. But it certainly makes sense that an approach that can somehow bridge or undercut differences in worldviews might be a good place to start if we are to address the culture war that is currently being waged against elites by the misinformation industry. Thank you.